Jason Wither from Nokia. Also, during Q&A, if you could, please come up to the microphone for any questions that you have, so that way those that are watching the stream can get the questions. And Jason, whenever you're ready.
All right, thank you. So I'm from Nokia Research Center here in Palo Alto, and we're working there on a lot of different things, sort of a lot around how to improve the AR experience without necessarily improving the tracking part of the AR experience. And so along with that, I think that AR is maybe not always the best choice for every application. Before I start, I want to just have some quick definitions, because I think these get sort of blurred a lot. So when I say AR, I have a very strict definition of virtual content overlaid on a camera view of the real world. And that's it. So none of the other things that some people call AR are in my AR definition. I like to use MR as a much broader definition. So for MR, I'm talking about any merging of virtual content and some representation of the real world. So that's really what I'm talking about today. And so a lot of that is going to be replacing the live camera view with maybe a panorama or some other representation of the real world. And because of that, we can do a lot more things because we have more control over the whole MR world. And by MR world, I mean that merging of your virtual representation or the virtual content you want to add and the representation of the real world. So all of that, everything you see on the device, which I'll call the MR world. And I'll use that sort of for AR or for MR. So to start, I want to start with a few images of AR browsers. And I picked these three, but there are lots of other ones as well. And I think almost all of them suffer from some pretty fundamental problems. First of all is they generally have pretty poor tracking, right? They're using sensors for tracking, which gives you a really poor experience. Things drift, things lag. Along with that, you have no knowledge of the environment, really, so you don't have any occlusions. So in all three of these images, you're not really sure where these annotations are, because they could be on the front building, they could be on something further away, but because there's no knowledge of the building, they're all just shown there. That also can lead to a problem where those two things combined, these annotations don't really have very specific things they're annotating. It might be a whole building, it might be something sort of in this general area, but they're not very specific. It's not, this is the door you need to go into if you want to walk to a Starbucks. And so that sort of large scale of annotation isn't really very useful or very specific in a way that it makes AR useful. All of those things together sort of make me think of these as not even necessarily AR. They're more of a compass application that's overlaid on a live view, because you're not really annotating or augmenting the live view, you're just putting the content, the virtual content, that may be talking about things that are much further away on top of the camera image. So in the case of the upper left here, those images, the virtual content, doesn't really have anything to do with that camera image. It has something to do with something that's much further away. So it's not really annotating anything there. So how can we improve these problems? Well, first of all, these are problems because they're hard problems. I mean, people have known about these things for a long time, and they're just not addressed in these applications because they're really hard. It's hard to do good tracking in general conditions outdoors. It's hard to know a lot about the environment. So all of these things are not done, not because people don't know about them, but because they're hard. So my suggestion, and what I'm going to be talking about today, is how we can improve these things, not by improving tracking, because, like I said, that's hard, but by changing the actual medium that we're looking at to mixed reality, and by improving scene knowledge some. So by sort of working around these problems rather than trying to just get through them, I think we can improve the overall user experience quite a lot. So the first thing I want to talk about is trying to avoid the registration problem rather than overcome it. And to do this, I'm going to be removing the live camera view, like I said. And so the goal here is to sort of improve that overall experience. So with true AR, it takes nearly perfect tracking, nearly pixel-accurate tracking to have a good experience, right? If things drift just a little bit, the experience doesn't look very good. If we use an MR experience, the hope is that we can expand that, so we can have less good tracking and still have a very good experience. And so I'm going to have two things here that I hope will convince you that that's a good, achievable goal in some ways. So the first thing is something we call indirect augmented reality. And it's indirect because we're not actually looking directly at the real world. We're looking at a picture of the real world. So in this case, we're replacing the live camera view with a panorama that's taken from at or near the same location the user's standing and looking around it. So the same tracking, still looking around with your device, but instead of seeing that live camera view, as you look around, you pan around in a panorama that's taken from the same spot. And so to start to convince you that this is going to be a better tracking experience, in the upper left here we have the perfect example. So we have, in this case, an image that's like the real world, and then a phone, and another image inside of that phone, which is like the on-device view of that world. And that on-device view also has overlaid some outline of the building, and that'll be our virtual content in this case. So on the right side, the top view, we've moved that virtual content 20 pixels over to the right. And you can see that it really looks horrible, right? That virtual content doesn't line up. The illusion of those things being joined is really broken. In the bottom image, that virtual content is in the exact same location, but we've moved the background image on the phone and the phone itself also over 20 pixels. So now to me, that bottom image and the upper left image are almost indistinguishable. You don't know that there's really any difference there, although there is that 20 pixels difference, the same as in the upper image. And the reason that they look so much better is because that registration error is much less noticeable there. Before, you have these very fine edges all around the building where you notice exactly when the registration is poor. On the bottom image, you've moved that registration error sort of to the boundary of the device. So instead of being all inside of the device where it's very obvious, it's between sort of the edges of the device where it's much less obvious. And this is actually a difficult case. In the real world, you have a wider field of view for your camera than if you were looking just through like a piece of glass. And so you have even more differences between your view through the device and your view of the real world. So this is even less obvious. And so because of this, you can have really pretty significant error, maybe 10 degrees of error or more, that's not really even noticeable to most users. If that didn't convince you, I hope it did, but if that didn't, we've done a user study for this as well. And in that user study, we showed people the same content in an AR mode and an indirect AR mode. And we showed them lots of different kinds of content. We showed them sort of simple content. Here's a picture of part of that panorama we used at the bottom where we just sort of overlaid some labels on different parts of a building. We showed them more complex content. We showed them things in a static view, which so there's not any people walking around. We showed it to them in a dynamic view where there is people walking around between them and the thing they're looking at. And in every case, people preferred the indirect AR mode. They thought it gave them a better experience. And in almost every case, almost 90% of the people didn't even realize that they weren't looking at a live camera view until we told them that. So halfway through, we didn't tell them what they were looking at, and they thought that it was just a better experience. They didn't realize that there was not a live camera view. They just thought that the tracking worked better. The pictures were clearer. There wasn't lag. All of those things just seemed like they were better, even though they were, in fact, a static, pre-captured panorama. One caveat here is that, of course, the location of that panorama does make a difference. If the panorama that you're looking at is from 20 meters away, you're not going to have the same experience as a true AR view. But we did find that there is some region. The panorama doesn't have to be right at the exact same location as the user. It can be sort of far away and still give the same experience, up to a few meters. And so with that, you can do this in a lot of places. I mean, there are a lot of places, many cities, that have panoramas all over them. And so you can use those panoramas to have this type of experience. So now that we've solved the tracking problem, the second thing that we want to talk about is how to create content in ways that works along with this. So if we have, so we need to have some way of creating this sort of semantic content that goes along with the real world. And if you do that locally, that's very easy, right? So that's sort of any AR application that is you're creating for a specific location. You're creating content to go along with that location. And by using MR, that becomes even easier because you can because you know more about the representation of the real world, you can make that the virtual content align better with that real content. And so just for a couple examples, I was going to talk about an experience we built a few years ago. This is sort of like a walking tour with a narrative and several AR experiences. So it was sort of a story that took you through Westwood outside of LA. And as you walked around, you were told the story about something that happened in the 50s. So the goal of the EMR was really to transfer people into that 50s environment that took place in the same location. And so the first thing we did there was we had this Pete's Coffee that used to be a Ralph's grocery store, and we wanted to transform that Pete's Coffee into a Ralph's grocery store to take people back into that 50s world. So we had them take a picture here, and to do this, we didn't actually have the computing power on the phone to do real AR tracking. So instead, we decided to do a static AR experience where we would just do it on a single image and then work from that single image. And the goal there was that by doing that, we could still have the same type of experience with less tracking. So we could work within our constraints and still have the same experience. So you can see they have some overlays. They line up no matter where you take the picture from. And then we transition fully into a virtual environment. So by using AR in that way, even though we didn't have the full capability, we still can create a good experience at the end that transforms people into that virtual world. We had another location where we wanted to do the same thing, but we wanted in this case to not focus on a single building, but on the whole environment around the user. So in the real world and the virtual world, we wanted to create around them. So to do that, we used a panorama all around the user. And again, you could look through this window of the phone, see that virtual world through the phone, and the real world around, and sort of line them up really well. In this case, again, we had really bad tracking. Our tracking drifted like 10 degrees, but nobody noticed it, either professionals or lay people. And people thought it was a very immersive experience. So all of that really sort of shows how, by working around these limitations, we can create compelling experiences still. And MR really helps with that because it removes these obvious sort of technology breaking points where the technology becomes really obvious when it doesn't work. So by working around that, we can have a much more complete and compelling experience by just sort of avoiding those really obvious points where the technology sort of sticks up and breaks the experience. So like I said, that's easy to do for a single location. It's harder to do sort of globally. How do we do that? Well, the first thing we need to do is create a lot more knowledge of the city itself. And so this obviously is a lot more complicated, something we're working on at Nokia as well. And so we need things like this, where we need a whole model of the city. So that's something we're working on. Another thing we need information about the city. So that's a harder thing, to have that information about the city be accurate and also timely. So along this way, we have an application called City Scene, which is sort of an enhanced POI browser. So by using those city models, as well as imagery, you can see in the top image how we've aligned them, we can do essentially a POI browser, but we can have several benefits over a standard POI browser. We can have occlusions, so in this bottom image you can see sort of where the dots are. They only are on buildings that are visible. We can actually dynamically place those icons on the buildings in visible spots. And for closer buildings, because we have the models, we can do overlays that align with the edge of the building. So just a quick view of what that looks like in a video. Oops. So they're just sort of looking around. So the next thing we're working on now is to improve that further, because we also have scene knowledge. We can do things like extract text from the images. And by extracting that text, this is an unreleased thing, it'll be released in June, we can then go beyond just the dots and have actual images. And so you can see here, this is great because it makes things bigger. You can see the actual text that's on the sign, and it becomes much clearer because of that, the wide field of view in the panorama. You wouldn't be able to see that text otherwise. So it sort of goes beyond that simple image. We can also use that for navigation. So this is going to be much more like navigating the way you would tell a friend directions. You wouldn't say go 4 blocks necessarily. You would say turn at the Louis Vuitton store. And so by extracting that imagery, we can then use those things with the panorama to give these such much more intuitive directions. And we also get the POI information, so we can see the POI. The textual information is also much more advanced. So with all of that, I have some final thoughts for these AR, MR, location-based experiences to make them better. I think the important thing is that as the granularity of location becomes finer, that AR and MR become more important. For these sort of very coarse level things where you know a Starbucks is 4 blocks away, AR is not very important. It's better to just look at a map to see how to get 4 blocks away. But as you want to know, is there an AR, is a Starbucks in the square, you could turn around and see that sign for the Starbucks across the street. A great thing for ARs and MRs, it allows you to look through the device rather than at the device. And I think that's something that really application developers should think about, is that you're not really creating the application to only be on the device, but as a way to use the device as a window into a larger virtual and real world. And finally, AR is a good choice for things that need much more immersion. So application experiences or entertainment experiences where you're building this MR world are great for AR or MR, whereas something like a POI browser might be just as well suited for a touch-based panorama experience because you don't need that level of interactivity and immersion. With that, I'll finish, and thank you.
So we'll take questions again, if you don't mind lining up here to give the questions, or if you are trapped inside of people, then I just ask if you can please repeat
Sure.
the question. So.
Well, it sounds like a lot of panoramas are needed. How are you addressing that?
Yeah, that's true. Well, there are a lot of companies, including Nokia, that are collecting panoramas in every city in the world. So that's hard to do without a big company, but there are lots of big companies that are doing that.
Sorry, so I'll add a little bit to that question. So why do we believe that it's easier to map every detail in the world and keep it up to date versus just fixing issues?
Right. So that's true. It is sort of changing the problem, right? So we're moving the hard part from the tracking part to the collection and maintenance of these huge databases. I would argue that to have a compelling AR experience with live tracking, you need that anyways. Because you still need that for occlusion, you still need that for content, and so, yeah, we're avoiding one problem, but you're going to have to address that problem in either case, the second problem.
So it seems that the panoramas are very location specific. So how do you solve the problem of kind of like adapting them to different people's locations, or do you just have to brute force capture panoramas from many different locations?
Yeah, I think there's two answers to that. Currently, we're mostly, well, so for local experiences, you can create your own panoramas. If you have an experience that you know is going to take place at a certain location, you can create a panorama for that location. If you're talking about something more like an AR browser where you have users that can be anywhere, I think you can either use panoramas that are anywhere, and that would be, you know, things that are collected by Nokia or by Google or something like that. And that's going to be a reasonable experience most of the time. In some cases, it won't be great because the panoramas are taken from the middle of the street and you're standing on the sidewalk, and from certain angles, things won't look right. So I think another approach would be to synthesize new panoramas at the user's location based on those existing panoramas. And that's an active line of research as well to do that panorama synthesis. All right, are we finished? Moderator?
I actually have a question. You talked about earlier using city data of the 3D models of the cities. How is that going? I mean, with the geospatial community, how involved are you with the work that they're doing, or maybe any formats that they're working with as far as leveraging that data?
Right, so within Nokia, I think we're working with our own internal data sources. So Nokia works with or has owned a company called Navtech for several years, and so they do a lot of their own data collection. So they have their own cars that collect the panoramas and LiDAR, and have their own other data sources for POIs and building models, other things like that. So some of that is sourced internally, some of it is sourced externally. Essentially, we as researchers treat it all as a black box that we just get the data. All right, thank you.